Montana Territory, 1879. Some men carry their grief quietly. David Waybright was that kind of man, the wealthiest rancher in Grady's Crossing, a town that owed him its livelihood, and a heart locked away the day fever took his wife and 2 children. He simply worked, and the town learned to leave him alone. Then the new saloon girl arrived, entirely unafraid of the man everyone else avoided. She saw something behind those walls nobody else had the courage to find. When the town turned on her and she had nowhere left to go, she showed up at his door at dawn. Not desperate, just certain. The wealthy rancher who swore he was done with love, and the woman who refused to believe him. The town of Grady's Crossing had a way of knowing when David Waybright was coming before he ever appeared. It wasn't anything a person could explain cleanly. A stillness, maybe, the way a room adjusts itself when someone significant walks in, even before the door opens. Men at the hardware store would glance toward the main road without knowing why. Conversations at the dry goods counter would drop half a notch in volume. Nothing dramatic. Just the quiet acknowledgement that the man most responsible for this town's heartbeat had decided, for whatever reason, to walk through it today. He came from the north end, where Waybright Ranch sat on 400 acres of good grass and hard work. 8 years of hard work, specifically. The kind a man throws himself into when there is nothing else left to throw himself into. He had a wife once, Annabelle. 2 children, a boy of 6 and a girl who had just turned 4. Fever came through the valley in the summer of '71 and did not discriminate between the wealthy and the wanting. It took all 3 of them in the span of 9 days, and it left David Waybright standing in a house that still smelled like them, with no earthly idea what a man was supposed to do next. What he did was work. He did not fall apart in public. He did not drink himself sideways or pick fights or disappear into self-pity. He simply put his head down and built something, and what he built was considerable. The Waybright Ranch employed 1/3 of the working men in Grady's Crossing. His contracts kept the feed store solvent and the blacksmith busy and the bank comfortable. The town respected him the way people respect a force of nature, genuinely, and from a reasonable distance. Nobody got close to David Waybright, not because he was cruel. He wasn't. He was perfectly civil when spoken to, fair in every transaction, and had never in 8 years given anyone cause to speak poorly of him. But there was something about the man that made people instinctively leave a wide berth, like a door that is technically unlocked, but clearly not inviting you in. He had not set foot in the Silver Bell Saloon in longer than most people could remember. So when his boots hit the floorboards that Thursday afternoon, the room did its usual thing, that half-second of collective adjustment, and then everyone found something else to look at very deliberately. The Silver Bell was the largest and loudest establishment in Grady's Crossing, which on a Thursday afternoon meant a piano playing something cheerful in the corner, and maybe a dozen people scattered between the bar and the tables. It smelled like sawdust and tobacco, and the particular warmth of a room that has held a lot of human living. David moved to the bar without looking left or right, set his hat on the counter, asked for a beer in a voice that said he wasn't looking for conversation. That was when he saw her. Not right away. He had his drink in hand and was studying the grain of the bar top when something in his peripheral vision simply refused to be ignored. He looked up. She was across the room, laughing at something one of the regulars had said. A real laugh, not a performed one, head tilted back slightly, one hand resting on the table for balance. Blonde hair pinned up with a few strands escaping around her face. A red dress that had clearly been chosen with some thought. She looked like she belonged exactly where she was, which was a thing some people spent their whole lives trying to achieve and never quite managed. He looked back at his drink. She appeared at his elbow approximately 4 minutes later. Up close, she was younger than he'd first gauged, mid-twenties maybe. Eyes that were doing the friendly, professional work of a saloon girl, while also, he noticed, being genuinely curious about something. About him, specifically. That was unusual enough that he registered it. She leaned against the bar with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in her own skin. "You look like a man who came in for something other than the beer." He considered that for a moment. "Beer suits me fine." A small smile. She didn't push, just stayed present in the unhurried way of someone who knows that silence doesn't always need filling. "I haven't seen you in here before. I'm Kate." He turned his eyes toward her more intently. "I know who you are." A trace of something, not quite amusement, but close. "My ranch hands haven't talked about much else since you arrived." He picked up his glass. "And you are?" He glanced at her sideways. "My name's David Waybright." Something moved through her expression. Recognition, recalibration. But she didn't pull back the way most people did when they learned his name. She just nodded once, like she was filing the information away for later. "Well, it's a pleasure, Mr. Waybright." He drank his beer. She read him correctly enough not to push further, and drifted back toward a table of men who were considerably more interested in being charmed. He watched her go without meaning to. He left his coins on the bar, picked up his hat, and walked out. The afternoon air hit him clean and cool after the warmth of the saloon. He settled his hat, turned toward the north road, and had taken maybe 6 steps when he heard the door behind him. He turned his head. Kate Walker was standing in the saloon doorway, one hand on the frame, the afternoon light catching her hair. She gave him a small smile and a single easy wave. Not desperate, not coy, just warm, like she had every confidence in the world that it would land. He turned back and kept walking, but he slowed down, just barely, without knowing why. Back inside, 2 of the older saloon girls had Kate by the elbow before the door had swung shut. "Sit down a minute." Loretta, who had been at the Silver Bell longer than the piano, pulled her toward a corner table with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman delivering important news. "You need to hear some things about that man." Kate sat. She was listening, but part of her was still at the doorway, thinking about the way he'd paused on the road. Loretta told her about Annabelle, about the children, about the fever summer that nobody in Grady's Crossing talked about out loud, but nobody had forgotten either. She told her about the 8 years of silence that followed, and the ranch that had grown like something David Waybright was building against his own grief, brick by brick, season by season. "The town loves him," Loretta said, and meant it. "But nobody goes near him, and he doesn't go near nobody. That's just the way of it." The other girl, younger, nodded along. "He hasn't so much as looked at a woman since Annabelle. Not once. You'd be wasting your time, Kate, and possibly you're standing here." Kate was quiet for a moment. Her fingers turned her glass slowly on the table. "That poor man," she said finally. And she meant that too, genuinely, with a fullness in her chest that surprised even her. But underneath the sympathy, something else had taken root. Something she didn't examine too closely just yet. Just a small, quiet pull in the direction of a man who had clearly forgotten that he was still alive. She let the conversation move on, but she didn't forget what she'd heard. She filed it carefully, the way you file something you intend to return to. He told himself he wouldn't go back. He went back 2 days later. He didn't examine the decision too closely. He'd slept poorly both nights, which he attributed to the change in weather. He had business near the south end of town, which happened to be nowhere near the Silver Bell, a fact he chose not to dwell on. Kate saw him come through the door and said nothing. She was midway through a conversation with a table of ranch hands, finished it gracefully, and by the time David had settled onto his usual stool, a fresh beer was sitting at his elbow. She hadn't looked at him directly once. He noticed that, too. She came over when the room gave her a natural opening, not rushed, not strategic in any obvious way, just present. She settled into the space beside him with the same unhurried ease as before and picked up a conversation that technically hadn't started yet. "The Hendersons lost a fence line in that storm 2 nights ago," she said, like they were continuing something. "Half the south pasture, from what I heard." He looked at her. "You've been in this town 3 weeks. People talk to me?" A small lift of her shoulder. "I listen." Something about that amused him, though it didn't reach his face entirely. The Henderson fence was old. It was going, regardless of the storm. "That's what I told them." He drank. She stayed. They talked. About the land, about the season, about nothing that cost either of them anything. But it was real talk. The kind that doesn't feel like maintenance. Somewhere in the middle of it, Kate sent the other girls a look that said she was fine here, and they drifted away without comment, and neither Kate nor David acknowledged that it had happened. He noticed. When he finally pushed back from the bar and reached for his hat, the afternoon had moved further along than he'd accounted for. He stood, and for just a moment, he looked at her directly. Not the quick measuring glance from before, but something slightly more considered. "You're good at this," he said. She tilted her head. "At what?" He settled his hat. "Talking to people." He walked out before she could answer. That evening, after the supper rush had thinned and the piano player had called it a night, the girls gathered in the back room the way they did most evenings. Someone had made tea. The lamps were low and the conversation was easy until Loretta set down her cup and looked at Kate with the particular expression of a woman who has decided something needs to be said. "We all saw that today." Kate didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "He sat at that bar for 2 hours, the younger girl said, not unkindly. "He doesn't sit anywhere for 2 hours. "He's interesting," Kate said simply. "He's complicated," Loretta corrected. "There's a difference, honey. A complicated man with that much locked up inside him. That's not a project. That's a life sentence." Kate looked at her hands around her teacup. When she looked up, there was something settled in her expression. Not defensive, not dreamy, just clear. "There are plenty of men with money walking through that door," she said. "I'm not after his money." A beat. "I'm after the man." Nobody said anything for a moment. Loretta picked her cup back up. "Lord help you," she said, but not without affection. Kate smiled and drank her tea. The man who arrived in Grady's Crossing the following week introduced himself as Harlan Pruitt. Cattle speculator, he said, out of St. Louis. He wore his money the way some men do, loudly and with the expectation that it would open doors that hadn't been offered. He noticed Kate the same way a man like that notices things he wants. Immediately, and with the assumption that wanting was most of the work, she handled him the way she handled most things, with warmth that left no actual opening. A smile that was friendly without being an invitation, gracious deflection wrapped so pleasantly that a reasonable man might not even notice he'd been turned away. Harlan Pruitt was not a reasonable man. She saw the look that crossed his face when she excused herself to the other side of the room. Brief, dark, the look of a man recalculating. She didn't think much more about it that night. She probably should have. By morning, the rumor had already made 2 full circuits of Grady's Crossing. The specifics varied depending on who was telling it, but the shape of it was consistent. Something about Kate Walker's past, about the real reasons a young woman ends up in a saloon in a frontier town, about the kind of girl she actually was underneath the charm. It was efficiently done. She had to give him that. The saloon owner, a decent enough man named Gus Heller, called her into his back office before noon. He couldn't quite meet her eyes when she came in, which told her most of what she needed to know before he said a word. He sat down heavily. "I'm going to tell you straight, Kate, because you deserve that much." She stood across from him, hands quiet at her sides, and waited. "I don't believe it," he said. "I want you to know that. I've watched you work for 3 weeks, and I know what kind of woman you are." He rubbed his face with one hand. "But it doesn't matter much what I believe. The town's talking, and this is a business, and I've got—" He stopped, started again. "I haven't got a choice here." The room was very quiet. "I understand, Gus," she said. And she did. That was the worst part. She genuinely did. She collected her things from the back room with the same composure she brought to everything. The other girls hugged her and said things they meant. Loretta pressed some folded bills into her hand and said, "Don't argue," and Kate didn't argue. She walked out of the Silver Bell into the hard afternoon light and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, thinking. She could leave Grady's Crossing, pack what she had, find a stage going somewhere, start the whole business over in a new town with a new face and nobody's rumors following her. It was the sensible thing, the clean thing. She stood there a while longer. Then she went upstairs to her rented room above the dry goods store and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about a man who had lost everything and rebuilt anyway, who had taken grief too large to carry and turned it into something that fed a whole town, who had walked into a saloon after years of absence and then walked back in 2 days later and pretended he didn't know why. She thought about the way he'd paused on that road. She made her decision. She went to bed early and set herself to wake before dawn. The sky was the color of cold ash when she rode up the long track toward Waybright Ranch. The land out here had a different quality than town, wider, quieter, with a kind of authority to it that the buildings and boardwalks of Grady's Crossing didn't possess. She could see why a man might pour himself into a place like this, could see how it might hold a person together when nothing else could. The house was large and well kept. Working lights already glowed from somewhere toward the barn. She dismounted at the front steps, tied her horse, smoothed her coat, and knocked. Footsteps. A pause. The door swung open. David Waybright stood in the gray morning light in his work clothes, clearly already an hour into his day. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that doesn't immediately compute. His expression moved through surprise and settled somewhere carefully neutral. She held his gaze. "I need work," she said. No preamble, no performance. "I'm a hard worker, and I won't cause you trouble. I'm asking plainly." He studied her for a long moment. Not her face, her eyes. Then he leaned against the doorframe, and something shifted in him. Subtle, like a change in weather you feel before you see. I know what happened, he said. Word travels. She didn't flinch. Then you know it wasn't true. I know. His eyes moved briefly over her hands, her posture. The composure of a woman who had clearly decided something before riding out here at dawn. I'm not running a charity, Miss Walker. I'm not asking for one. A long pause. The wind moved through the grass behind her. His voice came out gruff, matter-of-fact, like a man stating something obvious. You're far too pretty to be doing ranch work. I'll have none of that. He pushed off the door frame. There's housework that needs doing and a guest room sitting empty. You can stay until your situation sorts itself out. He stepped aside. Come in, then. She stepped inside. The house had been maintained the way a man maintains things when he is disciplined but not present. Every surface functional, nothing broken, nothing soft. Curtains that had probably not been opened fully in years. A kitchen that had seen food but not cooking. Rooms that were clean in the way of rooms nobody really lives in. Kate didn't announce any intentions. She simply began. The curtains came open first, and morning light moved through the house like it had been waiting for permission. A proper meal appeared on the table that first evening. Nothing elaborate, just real food made with actual attention. And David came in from the south pasture and stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment before he sat down. He ate without comment. But he ate slowly, which she noticed. The days settled into a rhythm that neither of them formally agreed to. He rose before dawn and went to work the land. She kept the house. Simple enough on the surface. But Kate was doing something else beneath the surface, patient and deliberate. She was learning him. She learned that he took his coffee before he spoke to anyone. That he checked the eastern fence line first, every morning without exception, though she never asked why. That he came inside earlier on the evenings when something had gone well on the ranch, and later when something hadn't, and that the difference was readable in the set of his shoulders before he ever reached the door. She asked him about the land, about the cattle, the seasons, which pasture held water longest through a dry summer. She asked about the business of it, the contracts, the suppliers, the decisions that had turned 400 acres into something significant. He answered in the careful way of a man not accustomed to being asked, and then in the easier way of a man remembering that he actually enjoyed talking about the thing he'd spent his life building. She never asked about Annabelle, never asked about the children. Some doors you don't knock on before the person inside decides to open them. One afternoon she was at the stove when she heard his boots on the porch steps. The door off the kitchen swung open and he came inside, stopping just past the threshold the way he sometimes did. That brief pause, like he was remembering to leave the outside world outside. Then he went still, something she was cooking, a simple thing, nothing she'd given much thought to, had filled the kitchen with a smell that clearly reached somewhere she had no map to. She didn't know what it meant. She only knew that his face, when she glanced up, was doing something complicated and private. She looked at him for just a moment, read what she saw, turned back to the stove, lifted the pot to the back burner, and set his plate at the table like it was the most ordinary moment in the world. He sat down. He ate slowly again. And that evening, he didn't go back to the barn after supper the way he usually did. He sat at the kitchen table while she cleaned up, and when she asked him something small and inconsequential about the spring planting, he answered, and then kept talking, and the lamp burned low between them while outside the ranch settled into night, and neither one of them moved to end it. That night Kate fell asleep in the chair by the fire. It happened gradually, the way it does after weeks of early mornings and long days. Her book open in her lap, the fire settled into low, steady warmth, the house quiet around her. Her head came to rest against the wing of the chair. Her breathing slowed and evened out, and the book slid sideways just slightly, held loosely in fingers that had stopped paying attention. David came in from checking the horses some time after 9. He pulled off his coat in the hallway and moved toward the kitchen for water, passing the sitting room doorway. He stopped. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at her. The firelight moved across her face in the slow, unhurried way of firelight that has nowhere to be. One strand of hair had come loose across her cheek. The book was going to fall in another minute if nobody caught it. He crossed the room quietly, lifted the book from her hands with the kind of care you use when you are determined not to wake someone. Set it on the side table, straightened up and looked at her again. Something moved through his chest that he had no immediate name for. It was not the sharp grief he had carried for 8 years. It was not the hollow, managed numbness that had followed. It was something else, something that had apparently been working its way back into him quietly, without his permission, over the course of shared suppers and lamp-lit evenings and conversations about fence lines and spring planting. He looked at this woman who had ridden out to his ranch at dawn with nothing but her dignity and asked for work, who had opened his curtains and set food on his table and asked about his land like it mattered to her, who had never once pushed at the places that still hurt, and somehow made the whole house feel inhabited again just by being in it. He reached for the folded blanket on the arm of the settee and opened it carefully, settled it over her, slow and deliberate, tucking the edge against her shoulder so the warmth would hold. She didn't stir. He stood there one moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he turned the lamp down low, added one more log to the fire so it would last, and walked to the doorway. He paused there, one hand on the frame, and looked back at her once more in the firelight. Then he went to bed. And for the first time in 8 years, he slept without difficulty, deeply and completely, all the way through until morning. It was an evening about a week after that, the dishes done, the house settling into its night sounds, when Kate sat down across from him at the kitchen table with the particular quality of stillness that meant she had something to say. She talked about where she came from. A small town in Missouri, smaller than Grady's Crossing, and considerably less kind about it. A family situation she described in plain language without self-pity, that made clear why a young woman might one day put what she owned in a bag and point herself west and not look back. She talked about the places she'd worked, the towns she'd passed through, the particular loneliness of being competent and personable and still, somehow, never quite landing anywhere that felt like it might hold. She watched his face while she talked. That was the real thing she was doing, watching to see if there was a man in there who could hold someone else's hard truth without flinching or fixing or retreating. Watching to see if the door had someone still standing behind it. He was very still while she spoke. When she finished, the kitchen held the silence for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at her. "I'm glad you ended up here," he said. 4 words, quiet as anything, but from a man who had rationed his words for 8 years, they arrived with the weight of considerably more. Kate looked down at her hands and smiled. Not the saloon smile, not the professional warmth she wore like a second dress. Something smaller, something real. She was glad, too. The following week, Harlan Pruitt came back through Grady's Crossing. Kate was on the main street with a list from David's kitchen, flour, lamp oil, a spool of thread, moving between the general store and the dry goods counter with the settled ease of someone who belonged somewhere now. She didn't see Pruitt until she heard his voice, which was the kind of voice that expected to be heard. He was standing with two other men outside the barber shop, and when he saw her, his face arranged itself into something unpleasant, dressed up as pleasantry. "Well now," loud enough to carry. "The Silver Bell girl. Found yourself a new situation, I see." The street wasn't empty. Several people had gone still in the particular way of people who want to witness something without appearing to. Kate kept her supplies tucked against her chest and looked at him with a steadiness that gave him nothing. She didn't have to answer. From across the street came the sound of boots on dry ground, measured and unhurried. David Waybright stepped off the hardware store's boardwalk and crossed the road at the pace of a man with nowhere urgent to be and every intention of arriving. He stopped beside her. Not in front, beside. Close enough that the statement was clear. He looked at Harlan Pruitt the way you look at weather that is an inconvenience, but not a concern. His voice came out low and level. "This woman works at Waybright Ranch. She's under my roof and my name. You'll speak to her accordingly." A pause, brief and final. "Or you won't speak to her at all." The street held its breath. Pruitt looked at David, looked at the stillness in him. The absolute unhurried certainty of a man who has nothing to prove and knows it. The kind of stillness that is more convincing than anger ever manages to be. Pruitt said something vague and moved on. Because men like that always do. The street let its breath go. Eyes moved carefully back to their own business, though the moment would be discussed over supper tables across Grady's Crossing for a good while yet. Kate looked up at David. "You didn't have to do that." He reached over and took the heavier of the supply bags from her arms. "I know." They walked back toward the ranch road together. The town watched them go. The walk was long enough that the town fell behind them, and the land opened up on either side, grass moving slow in the afternoon wind. They walked without hurrying, without filling the quiet unnecessarily. It was David who spoke first. He talked about Annabelle the way a man talks about something he has carried so long alone that setting it down, even briefly, requires a particular kind of trust. He said her name clearly, Annabelle, and then the children, James, Ruth, said their names like he was reintroducing them to the world or maybe just to himself. Kate walked beside him and listened. She didn't soften the edges of what he was saying by offering comfort before he was finished, didn't rush him through the hard parts, just walked beside him in the afternoon light and let the words come at whatever pace they needed to come. When he went quiet, she thought for a moment. "They sound like they were loved well," she said. He stopped walking. He turned and looked at her, fully, the way he hadn't quite let himself look at her before, like a man finally allowing himself to see something he'd been aware of for a long time. The light was going gold at the edges of the day. The ranch was visible ahead, the house warm-windowed and waiting. He was quiet for a long moment. "Kate," he stopped, tried again. Something in his face that was not quite the closed, careful arrangement she'd first seen at the Silver Bell bar. Something that looked actually a good deal like a man who had remembered how to feel things. "I don't have a speech for this." She waited. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not when your situation sorts out, not at all." His jaw worked once. "I want you to stay. Permanently." His eyes held hers. "As my wife. If if you'd have me." The wind moved through the grass. Katie, and she was already Katie to him, had slipped out that way one morning at the kitchen door without either of them marking the exact moment, and she had stood holding a dish towel for a full minute afterward thinking about it, looked up at this man who had built walls no one could cross, and simply found herself unwilling to believe there was no one standing behind them. She had been right. "Yes," she said, before he'd finished the shape of the question. Something moved across his face that had not been there in 8 years. Slow and a little uncertain, like a thing remembering how to work. He reached out and took her hand. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, careful as something holy. They stood there in the fading afternoon light for a moment, just the two of them and the land and the long quiet of a life deciding to begin again. Then they walked home. The wedding was small by intention, which meant almost the entire population of Grady's Crossing arrived anyway. Nobody had organized it exactly. The news simply moved through town the way things move through Grady's Crossing, through the feed store and the barber shop and the dry goods counter. And on the morning of the ceremony, people put on their good clothes and showed up, because some things in a town's life deserve to be witnessed. Loretta from the Silver Bell stood near the front and dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief and told anyone nearby she was doing nothing of the sort. Gus Heller came and shook David's hand with both of his and didn't say much, which said quite a lot. The ranch hands stood in a row in clean shirts that showed varying degrees of success with an iron. Kate wore a dress the color of winter cream. Her hair was pinned simply, a few strands loose around her face the way they always were. She carried herself the way she always had, like a woman entirely comfortable in her own skin, which was one of the first things he'd noticed about her, and one of the things, it turned out, that had never stopped being remarkable. David stood at the front of the small gathered crowd and watched her come toward him, and his face was open in a way that Grady's Crossing had never seen from him before. Not performed, not managed, just open, like a door finally, genuinely, from the inside, unlocked. The words were said, simple ones, the kind that fit the land and the people saying them. He slid a ring onto her finger. She looked down at it for a moment, then looked up at him. "Katie," he would call her for the rest of his days. The name that had slipped out that morning at the kitchen door like something that had always been true, and she would love it every single time. He had built walls no one could cross. She hadn't tried to break them. She had knocked and waited and simply refused to believe there was no one home, and she had been right.